besoin que de toilettes aussi. Mais là, nous pouvons espérer que nous pouvons finir notre travail pour tout témoignage de mois mars. Pendant plusieurs témoins aujourd'hui, mais dans certains témoins, pas nous les venir finalement, ou bien il dit il n'a pas rien pour ajouter. Alors nous pouvons aujourd'hui prendre témoignage des du monde, Madame Docteur Dogley et M. Bernard Georges. Nous commençons avec Docteur Dogley avant. OK. We will speak in English. On tient aussi les mon gars lettre sorti côté individu qui demande moi à cause nous ban possédés par en créole. Il y a plusieurs raisons pour ça. Transcription la cour il fait en anglais. Normalement là nous écoute témoin en créole, nous besoin de road un dimon pour venir traduire pour mettre le record. Et ça il pas dans nous moyens pour nous faire li. Alors tout le monde qui a cause anglais nous fait autres causes en anglais. Alors mon excuse pour ça. Mais mon croit qui comme une nation tout nous peut est capable cause ça la langue nationale. Alors mon croit pas il y a grande difficulté. So we will continue in English. Thank you for coming, doctor. Would you like to take the oath? Are you Christian? Would you like to raise your right hand and repeat after me? I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Thank you. Could you, for the record, state your full name and address, please?
My name is Dr. Frauke Fleischer-Dogley, and my address is Lenyol, Mahi.
Could you tell us in what capacity do you work in Seychelles?
I'm working as a Chief Executive Officer of the Seychelles Island Foundation. I'm doing so since 2007.
2007. Could you tell us what your qualifications are, Dr. Dogley?
I have achieved a PhD. That was a research work carried out in the sustainable management of the Coco de Mer, which I achieved in 2007, in fact. And prior to that, I've been trained in conservation biology, but also horticulture. So I started my education in '86 at the university in Germany.
Now, could you tell us what is SIF?
The Seychelles Island Foundation is mandated with the protection of Aldabra by law, the Seychelles Island Foundation decree, which was bringing into life SIF in February 1979. And one of the major objectives of the foundation is, in addition to the protection or for the protection of the Aldabra atoll, to instigate scientific research.
Thank you. And in that capacity, you visited Aldabra many times, I suppose.
I've been one of the privileged who can say so. They've been many times.
Thank
yes.
you. And can you explain to Seychellois what is the actual process of getting to Aldabra from, for example, Mahe?
So I've been traveling always by plane. So I've been never traveling by boat from Mahe. So taking the plane, it requires boarding a plane, which then takes 2.5 hours to travel from Mahe to Assomption. There is no airstrip on Aldabra, so therefore anyone going from Assomption to Aldabra has to board a boat. And there have been instances that we've been able to reach Aldabra from Assomption within 1 hour, 1 hour 15, 1 hour and a half. But there have also been instances where it has taken us 3 hours to do the crossing between the two places. And there is also a time during the year where you can't travel and cannot get off Aldabra to Assumption, which is actually the majority of the time of the year.
So would I be correct to say that is during what we call the bad season, which is from April to November of every year?
Correct.
It's impossible.
It is principally impossible unless we are lucky and have a very quiet day, but this is like observance on the day that you could travel.
So I would be correct to say the seas are very stormy. the winds are quite strong, both on Assomption and in Aldabra during the months of April to November.
That's correct. It is quite a difficult season at that point in time.
Okay. And would you say the conditions would be unbearable even for the people stationed at Assomption and Aldabra during those months?
I think it's very much different to what we are used on Mahe. So everybody will have their pullover out. So it's not freezing cold, but for a Seychelles it's freezing cold. So, so temperature-wise, it is quite different to what we experience on Mahe. And also because we are in the open sea, so the winds are much stronger being observed than on Mahe.
Okay. So in terms of where the wind is blowing, would it be blowing in the direction of Aldabra from Assomption or from Aldabra upstream to Assomption?
Okay, if we are talking about the southeast, then obviously it is coming from Assomption to Aldabra, but then with the turn of the monsoon, the wind then turns and it would be Aldabra to Assomption.
Thank you. So when exactly were you first informed of IDC wishing to have a development on Assomption?
I was informed in May 2023 by phone call that there is a thinking and an undertaking of considering a tourism development for Assomption.
And the phone call was from whom?
That was directly from IDC, from Mr. Savi.
Mr. Savi himself personally phoned you and told you that there was the potential or there was an actual development going to take place on Assomption?
There was potential and that they were investigating to look into the development.
What was your initial reaction?
My initial reaction was that development in Seychelles is heightening, so it's also reaching a different doorstep now, and it's at the doorstep of Aldabra, and therefore it will require quite some engagement of SIF to understand the impacts of such a development.
In May 2023, did he indicate what type of development was being proposed for Assomption?
He probably mentioned, but there was no mention of number of rooms, exactly number of peoples and so forth. So it was still rather vague, I would suggest.
Okay. When was the first time that you became familiar with the actual development itself, the type of development?
So the very first time then when I saw something in writing was a call for expression that was put out in June, 5th of June in Nation. And then from there followed there was a bit of silence, I would say. But in November, SIF was introduced to the CEO of the Asset Group, who had bid for the development. So there was a first meeting that was taking place in November.
Did, during that period, or during the very initial stages, did SIF engage with the Ministry of Environment?
We did indeed. Following the call for expression, which was in June, at a board meeting in July, it was raised that it is truly important that SIF is involved in understanding the development and to be in a position to assess the impacts and specifically mitigations to that development. So we actually did have a meeting with the Minister of Environment to discuss this and to raise our concerns because we had at the very same board meeting, in fact, decided the resourcing of the RACE feasibility project, which was looking into the eradication of rats and cats on Aldabra. So there was a direct link there as well.
Thank you. And obviously there was involvement from the rest of the board as well at this stage of SIF. So that was in November. What were the exact concerns of SIF in terms of development on Assomption and its impact on Aldabra?
Okay. just to make sure for the record, the meeting with the minister was before November, okay? But the first contact with the developer was in November. And the main concerns were from the outset biosecurity, biosafety, because of the vicinity of the two places. So we are talking about 28 kilometers of distance between the two islands. So we had to make sure that any impact in terms of invasive species of such an environment would be taken from the outset into consideration.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you've just outlined the concerns. Could you please expand on them and explain why these are concerns in terms of Aldabra?
Okay. Aldabra, in fact, SIF has did engage in 2012 with EU funding to undertake a huge project on Assomption, which was the removal and eradication of two alien bird species. That was a red-whiskered bulbul, bird species that was brought to Assomption by Mauritian workers who were involved in the guano mining at the time, and the Madagascar 4D. So the Madagascar 4D is very well known to us, especially in the inner islands. But on Aldabra, we do have an Aldabra 4D, and having a potential flyover from the Madagascar 4D to Aldabra would have resulted in interbreeding and potential loss of the species. So as a result, we sourced finance from the EU, and in fact had to cull over 5,000 Madagascar 4D and over 8,000 red-whiskered bulbuls to eradicate these from Assomption, so that this would not happen to Aldabra. So these concerns were actually raised since the beginning of 2000, but resourcing was an issue at the time. So in addition to that, SIF has also been involved in the eradication of sisal. So sisal has been eradicated from Aldabra. And in fact, I have to drag you back to the Madagascar 4D, because indeed, both species landed on Aldabra, but because we were timely in our observations and in our monitoring, we could eradicate both species with additional support from UNESCO. So biosecurity means that you have a species which is not, of which the place is not its home, becoming very propagating itself to an extent that it's very difficult for the species who have been lived there for times of evolution to actually being able to hold their habitats and their niches, to have the food sources, and we have invasive species at all levels. So we have it as species levels, as mammals, we have them as bird, we have them as plants, but we also have them as pathogens. So even pest and disease are of great concern for Aldabra, because these species, like the giant tortoise, for instance, of which Aldabra is the only place in the world to have this amount of tortoises being its home, they could be, just with a pathogen, the whole population could be wiped out.
Hence all the protections that you take from leaving Mahé and then from leaving Assomption to go to Aldabra. It's in terms of controlling the risk of those pathogens and other species being introduced into Aldabra.
Yeah. In fact, we've always seen Aldabra as the heaven and the jewel of Seychelles Islands, and that is definitely so. But since 2012, when we did undertake the eradication, we also recognized that it is not good enough to take species out, but it's even more important to prevent introduction. So ever since we have engaged and fine-tuned our biosecurity management measures, And when you were asking me, I didn't take a note of these, but for instance, when traveling by plane, sorry, we have to be there like 2 hours in advance, and all the luggage is being taken apart to really find out whether there's any species which should not be there. Everything is cleaned. If we find something that cannot go because there are certain bugs, insects which we don't recognize, that will need to be left behind. And so only after 2 hours of searching the luggage of everyone, then we proceed. And on Assomption, the same thing. There is a plant, the fagot, which can easily, actually the seed is thorny, and therefore you can easily take it with your shoes or otherwise into the boat. So there is another procedure just to make sure that this doesn't happen. And to date, we have not have had any invasion by these plant species, for instance.
So I just want to try and understand the relationship that SIF would have had with IDC in terms of the cooperation to allow the scientific research and the protection of Aldabra to happen, using Assomption as the base for the process to Assomption. Can you explain to the public how that always worked in the past?
Yeah. So over the years, it has been easier also in terms of the time to travel, to do so by plane. So which means that Assomption is like a second base for SIF, that all the staff, researchers, scientists, the kids who go to the eco school trip use as a platform then to board the boat to get to Aldabra. So we've had very good relations with IDC over the years, because also our staff coming with the boats to fetch the visitors, the visiting researchers, for instance, and our own staff, they have to stay for a number of hours, sometimes half a day, 3/4 of a day. And so there's always been close relationship with the island management there as well, to harbor them, to provide them with facilities for cooking meals for the day. So we've had always a very close relationship with IDC.
And financially, how does it work?
Financially, it is as such that SIF obviously is chartering the plane from IDC, and therefore pays for the plane. And then there have been also, we have not paid for the facilities on Assomption. So the facilities have always been provided to us. The same applies, in fact, to during the time when the Coast Guard was stationed there. We also were provided with the facilities free of charge.
Okay. So now we come to your funders, because obviously you cannot run without funding. So how is SIF funded?
Okay. So the majority of our funds is being collected via the revenue coming in the Valle de Mai. So this is entrance fees. This is also souvenir and sales in the cafe. On Aldabra, we do have impact fees. We do have some visitors coming by a few cruise ships that are traveling in the outer islands. So we do have an impact fee there as well. But in addition to this, we have always raised finance for project funding. So we have applied to, for instance, SECAT, the Seychelles Climate Change Trust, for funding to undertake our marine monitoring lately. We've received funding from the EU. We've received funding from the Indian Ocean Commission. So we are quite well versed in the funding of projects.
And you'd have trust funds as well, would you?
We do have a fund as well, which has been, yes, we do have that as well.
And could you please tell us, in 2023, who the Seychellois trustees were on SIF?
Okay. In 2023, the chair, Honorable Bernard Georges. Then we had Mr. Romano Laurence from Parle, representing Parle. We had Brigadier General Jean Talla, due to our close links with the Coast Guard, being out there in the middle of nowhere. Mr. Guy Esperon, who was a former warden on Aldabra. We did have now Minister Marie-Mé Jérémy and Ms. Sherifa Morel in 2023. I hope I have not forgotten.
Thank
someone.
you. And you also have some foreign trustees.
We do have foreign trustees, and the foreign trustees are Professor Nick Graham, who is a specialist, a fishery scientist, who's been working for many years with SFA. And because of our marine monitoring needing to be being looked at so that we are strategic in our research, so that's how we invited Professor Nick Graham. We also had Professor Lindsay Turnbull from the University of Oxford, who has been very instrumental in reviewing our population, tortoise population numbers, but also involved overall in population modeling and coral reef resilience. So she has led quite a bit of research there. With climate change being an obvious topic, that was important for us to have. And we have Dr. Anna Spensley. She is worked in Seychelles at the time, led also at the time at the World Conservation Union the tourism program for protected areas. So having quite an involvement with tourism, we felt it was important to have someone with that background. That's
Okay.
the one.
And the trustees would meet regularly, all the trustees abroad and in Seychelles, you would meet regularly.
We have a schedule of monthly meetings. I forgot someone, and that is Sir Tim Smith, and he is or was the CEO at the Eden Project because of our Aldaba House project. So we wanted to have someone with experience
Thank
there as
you.
well. Yes, the board meets regularly at a monthly. They do
Okay.
have a monthly schedule of meetings.
When did you inform the board of the phone call you had received from Mr. Savvy in terms of the development on Assomption?
So we had the discussion. I informed the chairman more or less immediately after I did have the phone call. And then the very next board meeting that was raised, and a first discussion was taking place. And in July, immediately, when the expression of interest was there was again quite a discussion at board
Okay.
level.
I can imagine that traditionally the SIF would have been there in terms of conservation measures for Aldabra. So I would imagine if I was a trustee and I learned for the first time there was going to be a tourism development about 20 kilometers from Aldabra, my first reaction would have been shock. Would I be correct?
I think everybody who's been involved, and you have to think that Aldaba is a place nobody really gets to. It is quite a surprise to everyone, I would say, yes.
Thank you. Hence, you wanted to be closely involved with anything to do with any development on Assomption.
That's correct, because just if I take as an example, the environmental social impact assessment is something which was reviewed by management and senior staff, but at the same time the revision was also shared with the board members, and there was quite substantial involvement of the board in forming our response to the scoping exercise, for instance.
So the scoping exercise was to do with the hotel. Were you at any stage told that the airstrip was going to be developed as well?
The airstrip?
Yes.
In fact, the airstrip had already been started to be built.
Before you knew about the hotel development?
No, we knew about the hotel development, but the airstrip had started to be built prior to the hotel development.
Did you raise any concerns about the airstrip being extended without any impact assessment being done?
So We only knew of the extension of the airport, more or less in terms of the extent of it, when we traveled to for our AGM in 2024. That was at the beginning in 2024. That's when we saw for the first time with our own eyes.
When you travel to Assomption?
To Assomption and then to Aldabra. The AGM of 2024 did take place on Aldabra, and that is when we did see that the airstrip, the extension of the airstrip at the time.
Okay, and when you saw it, did you raise the alarm and say, we've not been consulted, there's been no assessment done?
There was quite a discussion at the AGM, and following from the AGM, we also actually did undertake a press conference where the discussion of the airstrip and our concerns were also raised.
Thank you. Did you also raise concerns about the dunes being used for backfilling of the runway, or the reduction of the size of the dunes?
I think for the dunes, that was when you are at the same level. It's not as obvious like when you're having aerial views. So that was quite difficult to assess at the time. So when landing, you may have something like half an hour moving from the airstrip to the landing stage for the boat. So it was a bit difficult to understand with your blank eye at that time, the extent.
So it was only retrospectively that you noticed the diminution in size of the dunes?
Yes, that's correct. And we raised that for the in the scoping exercise.
And that scoping exercise was around February 2024. Would I be correct?
Yes.
Were there any concerns raised about the planning application for the extension of the airstrip and the fact that environmental impact assessment class 2 only was mandated?
That's correct. That was raised, yes. That was raised as a scoping meeting.
And what was the answers that were proffered?
As much as I recall it, it was said that an EIA was taking place. It was an EIA class 2. And because there was an airstrip in place already, it was deemed to be sufficient at the time.
Did anybody raise concerns about the fact that the runway occupied the whole width of the island and there would be difficulties for species in terms of the movement?
That wasn't raised at that time, no.
Is that a concern still?
We know that tortoises are roaming widely. So I think it is important for us to understand what the impact is of that setup now.
And we've received information from different scientists in terms of the dunes, and I want you to try and explain to me the difference between big dunes and small dunes and the environmental impact to Assomption.
So for the dunes, it is quite a very rare habitat setup. We don't have that much in Seychelles. So the Assomption dunes are quite outstanding in that regard.
Could you explain to the Seychellois how high are we talking about in terms of the height of the dunes, the big dunes?
There are several sizes of humans, so you can put several humans on top of each other for you to understand the size of the dune. And a dune is just a huge mass of sand, but because of the time it has taken for the dune to have been built up, so over the many years there has been quite some habitat that has established itself. So certain plants that are preferring this kind of conditions, and something what we recently learned also is that in terms of an ant species that is only found on Assomption, there might be some impact on its distribution if the dunes are being diminished in size and will not provide for the shadow they are providing now during certain times of the day.
So if I understand you, there's an ecosystem within the dunes itself, but the dunes also provide a certain amount of protection for other species inside the dunes.
That's correct.
Thank you. So you said that you did notice a reduction in the sound of in the size of the dunes. Do you know when that was noticed or when that was raised?
I personally have difficulties
Yeah.
to give you a date for that one because I think the next time I got the chance to travel again to Aldabad, that was 1 year later.
Yeah.
So which meant there was already a lot of discussion about the topic.
Yeah.
So therefore, so that's the next time I
Okay.
went, a year later.
And I would be correct to say that one of the big dunes was literally, it was gone. It was gone. A large amount of it had been taken out.
A larger amount had been taken out, so that was observed specifically this year in December when I went last.
Okay. And no explanation was given on why it was removed without proper assessment of its impact
No, there was no discussion.
to
on
this
that.
date. And are you aware that sand is still being excavated and used for the development of the hotel? And that some of it was used for the FIFA field?
In regards to that, then was used for the World Cup. That is again something which was then heard when it was said by the public in general. I did not know that before.
You didn't get any, I suppose, any notice it was going to happen.
No,
They didn't see you as an interested party
no,
in the removal of the dune.
no, no. not-
So in terms of the dune that was removed, in terms of years, how long would it take to regenerate, or is it possible to regenerate that dune?
Wow, that's a difficult question because I recall being on Assomption for the first time, in 2003, apologies. So about over 20 years ago. And I had the privilege to travel with David Stoddart, Professor David Stoddart, who at the time was really the authority. And he was speaking about the dunes, and we were sort of contemplating how long they've been there. So it must have been linked with an extreme weather event. So, and to really age that, we would need to go back really into historical records at the
Yes.
time. So
But the dunes were there during the guano exploitation years.
they were there.
They were
Definitely
already
they
there.
were there. So we are talking over 100 plus years, easily.
Okay, thank you. And do you understand why there is a different class of assessment for the hotel development and for the runway, given that the dunes were being reduced in size and the dunes were being used to backfill the runway?
No, I don't think there's a justification that there are different class of EIA being used for both. I mean, also in terms, despite the airport being there at the time, I mean, we are talking about a huge expansion of the airstrip, so so that should have required a class one.
A class one as well. Thank you. Okay, let's leave behind all of this now. We go to the scoping exercise. And you were first introduced then to the plans of the development. That was the first time. What was the impression of yourself and also of the board when they first saw the size of the development?
So there was a very first meeting that did take place 2 or so weeks prior to the scoping meeting that did take place at Roshkheimer. And that also, we were also invited to this one, that were the authorities, mainly ministries and government departments who were there. So yeah, we did see a high-class development with large areas that would be like one villa, contained for one villa. We would, what we were concerned with as well was that we did not understand the back of house at the time, so there was the presentation of how the villas will look like and so forth, but we had no understanding of the back of house, which for us is equally important because it is part of the development, and it's also where probably most of the operation is taking place, where we need to have certain measures in place. We also were asking about, for instance, the desalination and water treatment and so forth, which at that time was not available as an information.
Okay. Were you also introduced to other aspects of the development in terms of the fact that plants were going to be introduced and that animals were going to be introduced as well?
Animals, for instance, the horses. So there was the proposal of the horses, which we just couldn't comprehend how this should fit into the setup of the island, and it also as an activity. In terms of the plants, I think the plants of the visualization of the development was giving away that all sorts of different plants would be used if this artistic impression was to be implemented.
And then you met the assets group subsequent to that.
We've met the asset group, like I said, in a meeting in November for the first time, online via Zoom meeting, and then in terms of meeting the asset group, that was after the scoping exercise.
And how did that go?
I think in terms of the understanding, we were putting forward our concerns, which were always being listened to. But in terms of responding and saying this is what we are wanting to put in place, this is what we foresee, that was not necessarily forthcoming, I would suggest.
If I understand, your chair, Mr. Georges, raised the issue of the proximity of Assomption, and there was also the discussion about the amount of people who would be going to Aldabra. That was also an issue. Correct?
Yeah.
And what was the issue there?
I mean, in terms with people going to Aldabra, it is that, as we already mentioned before, there's a certain period of time you can't go. So, and that would mean that what are the means to travel to Aldabra? So would this involve helicopter transfers? What would be the way of transfers? What would be the frequency? What would be the number of people, as you already suggested? So that was very unclear.
Yeah, and I believe the answer was that there would be helicopters stationed there to bring guests across every day, and that there would be planes dedicated to bringing over persons either directly to Assomption or through Mahi. That was the answer, correct?
Yeah, there was a potential, to look into that, but that was not sort of clarified and said this is what the plan is.
Was SIF happy with that?
I mean, there was again quite a bit of discussion about that, and what is clear is we do have a Aldabra management plan. The management plan currently does not discuss and doesn't allow any helicopter operations. So that would have needed to be a revision of the plan and to see whether that could be allowed, and if so, what would be the measures behind, and if not, why it cannot be allowed.
For the people who don't understand why helicopters should not be allowed, could you explain why?
So
in terms of its impact on Aldabra?
Yeah, so on Aldabra we do have huge bird colonies, some probably the largest in the world. These are frigate birds as well as boobies, red-footed boobies. So in that context, to have safe helicopter operation, you would really need to stick to a certain flight route, and you would need to make sure that only this is followed, that there's a certain distance, and so forth. So there are things which actually we as SIF are not necessarily in the know, because we haven't done it before.
Okay. We talked previously about there were plans also. It was outlined that they wanted to have gardens to plant vegetables for consumption by the hotel. That was also a concern that was raised by the SIF. Is that correct?
Yes, because there was quite a number of different restaurants with different cuisine and therefore different requirements. So, I mean, growing vegetable then requires you bringing in also fertilizer and you name it. So things which are which would all need to be discussed beforehand, you know. So, and especially also certain seeds probably where you don't know how they would do on
So
Assumption.
it would impact on the ecological aspects of Assomption.
Definitely, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Negatively?
You would definitely alter a certain area for the sake of providing to the hotel.
And would you, for the record, tell us how much rainfall is there on Assomption and Aldabra?
Oh, it's very limited. It's as limited that like if you go there in November, it looks desert-like, you know. So you are not very impressed in November of these places.
How many millimeters of rain roughly a year?
Oh, now you're. Now I have to. But it's.
Is there enough water falling as rainfall to be collected to give water to the people living on Assomption? Or does
Definitely
water
not.
have to be brought in?
Definitely not. So we will definitely need a substantial desalination set up there
Okay.
for being able to provide the water that is required for the hotel itself, but even for anything in relation to its operation.
So that would have implications as well. Thank you. Okay, so could you please now tell us, after the meetings, those meetings that had happened, and the setting up of the EIA or the assessment for the EIA, how things progressed? If you could, in your own words, tell us what happened.
So following the EIA scoping exercise, the ESIA was undertaken. We did review it and we raised certain concerns which centered mainly around the biosecurity aspects, because that was a direct concern of ours. And and secondly, we also raised the issue of the biodiversity assessment, which at the time was not encompassing especially the flora. So there was an excellent survey of the, I have to correct, not the flora.
The
The flora
fauna.
was there, but the fauna wasn't there. Apologies, yes.
Thank you. And the ESIA was being conducted by ICS.
Yes.
Was there friction between ICS and SIF when you raised those concerns about certain matters not being taken into account?
I think we had quite an open discussion about that, and it did take, specifically in regards to the biosecurity concerns, that was very much listened to by ICS, I would say. In terms of the biodiversity assessments, we in fact provided information which we were aware of, because when you talk about Aldaba is part of the Aldaba group, so there has been research taking place not only on Aldaba but also involving the other islands. So we actually informed and sent over certain research and scientific papers we did have to enrich the process with ICS.
You asked to be engaged in the SIA process, and in fact you were invited to take part. I mean, SIF was invited to take part, but at some point SIF decided not to take part.
We were invited to a working group which was specifically looking at identifying the necessary biosecurity measures. And the biosecurity, despite our extensive engagement and us undertaking it ourselves for Aldabra, but you have to look at Aldabra having a population of 25 people. That's the operation. And our understanding from the Assomption population was to be, whilst during development being 500, so that's 20 times more. That was definitely over and above our head. And we therefore recommended that international consultants should be sought to undertake and develop the biosecurity management plan. So we did also, one of our board members, international board members, was putting forward certain suggestions of resource people, and that's what we did then send over to ICS and IDC, who then employed one of the consultants we had proposed.
Okay. That was Mr. Millett, was it?
No, that they had Mr. Millett on board before that. Mr. Millett worked in Seychelles on the UNDP project funding, and has been involved in biosecurity, but from our knowledge, we thought it needed someone with operational understanding and not someone as a consultant who does reviews.
So Mr. Corson was brought in.
Mr. Corson was brought in.
You were happy with that?
Mr. Corson, we were happy with Mr. Corson. We also had several meetings with him when he came out for the development of the management. But I think he's a New Zealander, and he was of the take that many things could be done in a consultative discussion, partnership arrangement. And we thought that because we have so many changeover of staff on the islands as well, overall, you know, there are certain type of people who can be on islands forever, but there are others who can't do it for that long. So we felt that it could not be done on a good rapport between people and scientists of same interest and managers. We thought there needs to be a proper framework that needs to be established also in terms of incursions, reportings, and so forth.
When did you decide to step off the working group? When did SIF decide to step off from the working group?
In fact, it was sort of an on and off situation, because we also were fully aware of the impacts of biosecurity for Aldabra. So that was one of the reasons we could not really turn our back at all. So it was this sort of on and off situation, I would suggest.
Okay. I'm trying to make it clear that there were numerous elements involved. There was the ESIA report being written up.
Yes.
There were biosecurity. There was also biodiversity. All these really form part of the ESIA. Am I correct?
Correct.
And then the ESIA was, you took part in the scoping exercise. You made your concerns known, and then you didn't see the ESIA report first of all, did you? When it was first sent to the Ministry of Environment.
No, we did not see it immediately. That's correct. It was, we did provide as much input as we could, but then it was sent to the Minister of Environment, and then the Minister of Environment would send it back to us for our revision.
Okay. And when it came to you, you noticed there were certain aspects lacking from it.
Yes.
And you raised those concerns.
Yes, we did.
And what was the reception from IDC, from ICS, in terms of the matters you raised? I'll come straight to the point. Did they find that you were slowing the process, or that you were unreasonably obstructing the development?
I think overall there was obviously very tight timelines that were being sort of followed for the process, and yeah, so in certain you could actually say yes that they felt that maybe the process was unnecessarily delayed. Even, for instance, the appointment, we asked for the appointment for the biosecurity consultant was obviously a delay in the process. Yes.
Was it ever explained to you why the timeline was so tight? Why it had to be done very fast?
I think there was only an overall take of, development is costing every day, so it needs to happen is in very tight time frames because it's costing, it's costing money. So I think it was being looked at that this is how the way development is being undertaken. So, but there was no specific explanation why it needed to be taken within this time frame. But there were just the project timeline sort of being put on the table. That's it.
Nevertheless, in June 2024, you requested that the ESIA be completely reconsidered. You were not happy with the ESIA, am I right? And it still went ahead. The ESIA was accepted by the ministry, and the notice to start was given for the development. Yes?
Correct.
What was disappointing about the ESIA? What was lacking in the ESIA?
The main areas that were not covered was the fauna assessment. So there was no recent information on the fauna, and despite us having put forward this information on marine research that had taken place, even on bird counts, because when we did the eradication of the 2 bird species, we did also bird counts of the sunbird, which is endemic on the island. So these were all not being included in the assessment, and therefore also not what would be the impact.
Okay. Did you raise concerns about the fact that the SIA had not addressed the whole cycle of seasons on the island and the different impacts of the different seasons on the island?
It is correct that the islands, because of these huge difference in monsoons, do have different cycles. And I think there are certain times in the year where there are for different species, there are different, have different importance. So, for instance, the Norwest has quite an importance for reproduction, in terms of the bird species, tortoise species. So that would have been a cycle that needed to be covered, definitely, because that's probably where also the biggest impact is going to stem from the development.
So you weren't happy with the development taking place in terms of the SIA that had been conducted?
We felt that it was not sufficiently covering all aspects.
You were also not happy when the development started and there was no biosecurity officer in place to monitor the development?
Yes, specifically on Assomption, it was extremely important to have the biosecurity setup implemented.
You were also not happy with the fact that the biodiversity assessment was to take place alongside the development?
In terms of the biodiversity assessment, strictly speaking, it should have been part of the ESIA.
It should not have taken place in conjunction with the development?
No, because you will have to understand the impacts of the situation at the time. So when development is ongoing, then there has already been a certain impact. So it's difficult then to construct the full picture.
Thank you. So, can you tell us what happened then at that stage? I mean, you had raised concerns. There were several people contacting the SIF. There was Friends of Aldabra. There was meeting in the assembly where the VP was saying that the hotel on Assumption would bring in money, etc., etc. You also were taken to the assembly at some stage.
Yes.
Could you please explain that for the record?
So in fact, we had in we are 2026. So in February, it was
26.
we are now 26.
Yes.
In February 2025, at the State of the Nation address, it was then made clear that SIF is to take on the role of the environment.
Had you been
protection.
consulted before that?
There was consultation at board level, so there was certain discussion. I personally was at the time on Aldabra, so.
Would I be correct to say that you were all surprised by the State of the Nation address when suddenly the President said the SIF would now do the biosecurity and conservation on Assomption?
For us, the main issue has been the resourcing.
No, that's not my question. My question is, were you all taken by surprise? You were not expecting to be doing that because all along you had said you did not have the capacity. You explained earlier, you did not have the capacity to do that kind of work. So it came as a bit of a shock that suddenly you were being landed with this new job.
I would assume, I would say yes to some extent, yes.
Okay. So therefore, I assume, I'm trying to understand, as many people are trying to understand, Mr. Ramkalawan, as the head of state, was also the patron of SIF. Correct?
Correct, yes.
And he had engaged with the SIF about his conservation measures all along, the things that it does. He became the patron of SIF when exactly?
With resuming the office of the president, he became the patron of SIF.
So he had attended board meetings?
He attended 2 annual general meetings, yes.
Before the hotel development was announced?
Before the hotel development was announced, yes.
So I see SIF as being, I suppose, the protector of Aldabra, okay? Making sure that Aldabra is conserved for humanity and for the generations to come. Now suddenly you have your patron advocating development on Assomption. How does that sit with SIF's mandate?
I think SIF made it clear from the outset that SIF is not against development. And if we've been listening to the Friends of Aldabra, it's clear they are against development. So our stand was not, or is not, that we are against development. And the reason for that is Aldabra being as far away as where it is, a development that is assisting SIF in its mandate is actually
welcome. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, we've had different views of what development would have been sustainable and acceptable to Assomption. I believe most people who came here said they'd been very happy with an eco-tourist resort. Could you give us your understanding of the type of development or resort that would be acceptable or sustainable given the biodiversity concerns, the biosecurity concerns for Aldabra?
In regards to development, it would need to be one that is respecting the environment, so that the environment is part and parcel of what is being also being marketed, by the development, which also includes the resourcing of environmental work that is going on, where guests can contribute to as well at the same time. So it is a development that is has a very good understanding of the environment.
Sensitive to the environment.
Sensitive, yes. Thank you for the word. Yes, sensitive.
You've seen the magnitude of the development, the footprint that it was to occupy, especially along the whole of the beach, the 4-kilometer beach. Is that a sustainable development in terms of biodiversity, biosecurity for Aldabra?
In terms, the footprint itself, if you look at the percentage that is going to take it away from the, or what that has been developed on Assomption, if you look in terms of the figures, the footprint itself is not big, but the operation of such a development, that is the issue as well in terms of, what do you need to bring in on a regular basis, how the operation That is a question in terms of sustainability. Yes,
Both for the hotel, but for the development, it was anticipated 500 workers would be there.
For the construction.
For the construction.
Yes, and then if I recall you correctly, at the time for the scoping, it was over 300 something workers then to operate.
It became bigger, but even that, in terms of the impact of 500 humans eating, excreting on an island.
It's a huge operational undertaking, which, if you want to make it environmentally friendly, is going to be costly. It's going to cost something to turn it into something that can be sustained. There's no question.
Okay. And had there any studies been done in terms of how many visits Aldabra could sustain in a year?
No. This has not taken place. So if you look at the district of Cascade, this is the size of Picard, and that is where now visitors are being received. So it's a very small area. If we think of Aldabra being slightly bigger as a landmass than Mahe, so Mahe fits within the lagoon. So this is the only area that is currently allowed for visitation. And when you look at, I think the other day we had Queen Mary here as the largest ever recorded vessel coming here. So our visitors are less than the amount of the total number of passengers that come to visit Aldabra in 1 year over a period of several months. So it's really spread out. We do have a one vessel at a time policy. So it is well managed, and there's permanently SIF staff with the visitors as well.
How many visitors a day during peak season?
It's regardless whether there's peak season or not, but there's not more than 100 visitors
per day. And they only are allowed on a specific part, a very small part of the Aldabra.
Aldabra. So
what is the impact of that anyway?
The impact of these visitors?
Of these visitors, 100 visitors a day.
I mean, the impact is that they are visiting the research station, so they have a bit of a walk. They will have maximum 4 hours on the atoll because of the tide. They have to come and go with the tides, so it's very limited.
Okay, so there is very little impact.
Yes, very little impact.
If you were to increase that to 3 times, would that have an impact?
Be, as it stands now, not being manageable for us.
It would not be manageable. No. Okay, thank you. Okay. Let's move to the development starting now and taking place, and no biosecurity officer still appointed, and you raising that concern. Okay, so what happened? Why was there no biosecurity officer appointed?
Okay. In following the announcement of SIF's involvement, so there was the AGM in March, which was deliberating on how is
March 25, if
March
I may add, for the record, yeah.
Yes. And that was then deliberated by the board, what would the involvement look like. And subsequently, we had also received a first draft of a memorandum of understanding, as it was called, by the developer, but which if you would read, looked like an employment contract. So we were unhappy with how the MOU was placed out. And therefore, it did take us until August to put it into a memorandum that was a framework for providing SIF with the overall, and the developer, both of us, with the overall understanding how we would be involved with each other. But it was clear that this needed to be further negotiation in terms of contractual understandings and resourcing and financing. So when the MOU was completed, then after that the resourcing was discussed, and resourcing was not forthcoming. So there was a lot of questioning why these amounts
That you're talking about the MOU that was signed in August.
in August.
But before that, there had already been the first suspension of work. There was a notice issued.
Yes, you're
Okay.
correct.
Yeah.
Yes, in May.
So could you talk us through that, please?
Okay, yes. The first suspension was based on the fact that no biodiversity assessment had been conducted until then. There were no surveys being taken place. And also there was no, like you said, no biosecurity, whatever set up in place at the time. So that was one of the main reasons why the stop notice then
It was issued, but it was lifted a few days later. Did you attend the meeting at State House, which discussed the notice, the suspension notice, and then its lifting a few days later?
I was attending a meeting at State House that was discussing the appointment of the biosecurity consultant at the time and the delay of for the biosecurity management plan taking place. So that was in July. That meeting I attended, but I did not attend any other meeting at State House.
That was the only meeting you attended to do with Assomption in
Yes.
State House. So there was a suspension of work, and then a few days later, it was allowed to carry on. And yet, the same concern that had been raised had not been addressed. Would I be correct? There was still no environment officer appointed, still nobody there, and yet construction was taking place. Did SIF raise concerns about that? That the development was taking place and none of the concerns were being addressed?
I think we were very much embedded into the negotiations of the MOU, to be honest. So
Okay.
we were really focusing on getting this framework sorted out for us to be able to have a presence and to know what is happening on Assumption.
And when was the first officer then appointed?
The officer was then appointed at the end of August.
And how long did he last?
No, I'm not correct. In June.
In June.
In June, not in August was the second appointment.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So the first one in June lasted a couple of weeks. Would I be correct?
2 weeks or so.
2 weeks, and nobody took his place? Not until August.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, thank you. So then followed a change of government, and there've been a working group set up now, and you were part of that.
Yes, the task force,
The task-
Assumption task force
okay.
was set up.
What is it doing differently than the previous groups that met that had to do with the development, if anything?
Yeah, I think from my involvement, I can say that it's been extremely helpful to have actually every authority on the task force. So, which means it's obviously the Minister of Environment, but there's also the Planning Authority, representation of IDC, and SIF, which allows I think a better flow of information, you know, because even as SIF, our main day-to-day task is scientific research. So we are not necessarily in the know of planning laws and you know, the implementation of those. So having this platform of this consultation makes quite a difference to us.
Would it have better scrutiny of the development taking place?
Prior to the task force being enforced, there was no resourcing of SIF, the work of SIF. So since the task force has been in place, resourcing of our work has happened, in fact, exactly 1 month ago, the 3rd of February. So it's been a long journey, and something what I think needs to be understood. It cannot be one organization, one institution being responsible by itself for the protection and of Aldabra, it needs partnerships. And I think with this new setup, that this is easier to be to be achieved.
And SIF has now been tasked with the biodiversity assessment, am I correct?
That's correct.
And you are trying to recruit scientists and
recruit.
officers to carry out that assessment.
Yes.
Am I correct? Yes. I'm going to finish very fast, you'll be pleased to hear. But I just want to ask you, in terms of lessons going forward, what has been learned about this development, how would you do things differently going forward for a development on a very sensitive environment such as Assomption?
You know, by law, there is provision for stakeholder consultation, there is provision for engagement, and if we look at what is being put forward, and I assume while you were assessing the evidence as well, stakeholder consultation has taken place, but I believe the time for being able to engage with stakeholders, especially when concerns are being raised, the time frame needs to be looked at. So if we are pressing through a process, you know, making sure that it's been on inspection for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and then the very next day we take it out and we are not providing necessarily the information that might be required, that's not very helpful. I think the time frame also needs to be looked at. I'm not saying that it needs to be double, triple the amount of time, but maybe when stakeholder concerns are being raised, there needs to be a rethinking how these can be addressed. So I think that's one of the biggest lesson learned, that for SIF it felt we had to upkeep with a tight time frame, and we did not also have the resources to do so, you know, and obviously we cannot take resources that are generated via the Validime and Aldaba for the World Heritage Sites to address issues for Assumption. That would have been just ethically wrong as well.
So if I understand you correctly, the engagement with stakeholders in terms of what happened in Assumption was more or less tokenistic. They were consulted, but there was not much time spent on it. There was not much input that was taken into account really in the final ESIA that was produced and accepted. But I also understand that there was considerable pressure both from IDC and from the developers and from the government. Do you have anything to say about that?
That's what I mean. As SIF, we had to work with very tight time frames. So, and this being a substantial development, we actually at times had to put aside the work we would normally do just to be able to do the diligence in terms of assessing the documents and really making sure that this was addressed and being also communicated like that. So yes, it was a very, and it's still a very intense time frame we have to work with, and I think this is something which needs to be re-looked at. I understand that development is very costly, deployment is very costly, but we also know so better you plan beforehand, so less you have to be confronted with situations like stop notice and you name it, you know.
Okay.
So if things are in place beforehand, you don't have to encounter then other delays.
Okay. So the development is going ahead now at present, is it?
There has been a variation notice that has been given, so which I understand means that whatever has started to be constructed, on construction, that this is being allowed to continue.
Like what?
There have been a number of villas that have started, so my understanding is that these are being completed.
So the ones that are at foundation stage, as well as the ones that are at wall plate level, as well as the ones that are at roof plate level. So all of those that have already had something in the ground will be constructed? Is that your understanding?
That there is a certain, I would not want to declare myself exactly on how many villas these are, but where construction has like the foundation and so forth. That's my understanding is going on.
And have you any concerns about that? Has
Our
SIF any concerns about that?
Our concerns are still the same in terms of biosecurity, that this needs to be addressed and immediately. So we do have a setup now where SIF is directly involved in the biosecurity. But like I said before, you know, our vessel, just to give an indication, to go to Aldabra has a tonnage of 150 ton. We have now a vessel that has a tonnage of 6,500 tons that is awaiting clearing. So the size, the dimension of the biosecurity management should not be underestimated.
Have you any concerns about the fact you've just said as a variation of the notice and development will continue in many aspects in terms of what is already there? Is it a concern that that will go ahead without the biodiversity assessment?
In terms of the biodiversity assessment, I think what we need to understand is that Assomption is a sensitive ecological area. However, at the same time, Assomption has been heavily impacted during the time of the guano mining. So it's a little bit, I've been trying to say it's like a bipolar person, you know, you have the depression and then you have, but what we should really emphasize on, and that is our concern at SIF, that the potential of Assomption to be rehabilitated and restored in terms of the different seabird species that have been there, that this is taken fully into consideration of the development. That should be part and parcel. Because something what has happened in the past is that everything comes like, okay, we've done this, now we can talk to the developer about that. That shouldn't be the case. It should be all encompassed. The conservation of Assomption, the restoration of Assomption needs to be part of the discussion now. And that's why at SIF we've been putting forward a huge budget for everybody who has followed the hearings now, of which only 4.3 million is for the eradication of rats and cats and mice on Assomption. And that is not easy to communicate to a developer, because the developer is saying, you're talking to me about biosecurity, but there are rats, you have rats, what is the issue? You know, so, but the issue is really Assomption needs to be given the opportunity to be restored.
Thank you. Thank you. You've been very patient. Thank you so much for helping the Commission. You may leave.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you.
We're going to take a small break of 5 minutes. Thank you. Itaya? Itaya? Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, I had prepared a little statement, which we haven't come to, but in principle, that was to reinforce that we believe that we've taken our mandate very seriously. And maybe still on record, I just would want to say that the team at SIF has actually put a tremendous amount of work into all of that and has not been compensated for that.
I know that. With a lot of personal dedication